morning. Over before you guys take your quiz, as last time, it's going to be collaborative. So you guys can use each other. You just can't use notes and electronic devices or me. Okay, so from the first objective, what questions do we have? We want to check, want to go over, anything like that. That's number 4. Okay, so with 1 through 4, there's really no work. Well, perpendicular is a little bit of work, but not a whole lot. You're really just making up a new equation that would be parallel or perpendicular to the one that's given. So for number 4, if it's perpendicular, we need to flip the slope. Make it positive. And then pick whatever y-intercept you want. You can leave it as 4, you can leave it as 0, doesn't matter. Yes.
Could it still be +4?
Sure.
Or is that
For perpendicular, that works. For parallel, you have to choose something different. So this is parallel, it has to be the same slope. And then a different y-intercept. So you can do -2, 0, whatever number you want. It just can't be +2. Because if you put +2, that's the exact same line. We don't want that. Okay, so for this one, you have to know your slope. We know that, or you should know that this is undefined. And if we need a slope that is perpendicular to that, what would that slope be? 0. So that means your new equation is going to be a y equals, pick whatever number you want. Math.
6.
With 6 and 5 through 8, these are all similar. You're doing the same process where you're given an equation, you're given a point. Notice if it says parallel or perpendicular. If it's parallel, your slope is going to stay the same. If it's perpendicular, your slope is going to change. You're going to use your point slope formula. I'm going to write that over here. Y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. Christina, Scott, do you guys have your review from last class? Okay. So for 6, since the slope has to be the same, we're going to use this exact same slope, 1/5. We're going to ignore the rest of that equation because we don't need it. And then we're going to use the point that's given. So this is going to be y minus -2 equals 1/5 times x minus -5. If you want to go ahead and change that to a plus automatically, you can. I'm going to do that now. And then the solving process is the same. Distribute, get y by itself. So far we have y plus 2 equals 1/5 x plus 1. Get rid of 2 by subtracting it to the other side. So y equals 1/5 x minus 1 would be our equation that is parallel to the one that's given. For 9, I would find the equation of this line, or at least the slope. You don't really, you kind of need the y-intercept for the parallel, so it's not the same. Y-intercept is at -4, slope is at +2. So our A part will be parallel, have the same slope, just a different y-intercept. pick whatever y-intercept you want. B, you're gonna take this slope and flip it. And make it negative and put whatever slope you want. Other questions on the first page? Oh, which one? Nobody.
Wait, does it matter?
Does it matter for?
So for A, does it matter like with the Y and sometimes?
Yes and no. It just can't be there. Besides that, it can be whatever you want.
So it can negative or correct. So you could just the easy way is just put the opposite.
Sure. Or just leave it blank unless it's already 0. Then don't leave it blank.
And you can put it
I just put it as the same because they could be the same, it could be different, it doesn't matter. Because the slope is already different, so they're not gonna be the same line. Right, for number 8, this is similar to 6, except the slope has to change first. So it was 1/7, we're gonna take that and flip it and make it negative. And then use that and the point given with our equation, our point slope equation. I'm gonna do that over here. So y minus -5 equals -7 times x minus 1. Distribute and make this a plus, or you can make this a plus automatically. And then get y by itself by subtracting 5 on both sides. So y equals -7x plus 2 would be the equation that is perpendicular to the one that's given. Christina.
It wouldn't really differ six, but did I just like do it to y1 minus y2 over x2
So you don't need to find the slope is given.
for like the one that's for the other
You don't need to do the slope, you just need to flip it.
for the 20?
So you're not doing the y2 minus y1 because that's to find the slope. You're just using this equation. The slope is already given. Or you just have to flip it. Right, other questions on this page? On to the next. Okay. Okay, questions on this page? Taylor.
10,
So this one, it gives you different scatter plots and is asking which one represents 3x plus 1. I would say 1, the slope is positive, so if you see negative slopes, we can eliminate those. So it has to be A or C. And then of those, draw a line that would represent what you have, starting at 1. Slope of 3, so go up 3 to the right one, down 3 to the left one. This is probably not the greatest color. And look at which of those do the points surround better? A or C? C. So that would be your answer. Other questions on this page? If you don't already, take out the page of instructions from the line of best fit notes. You can use that as long as there's nothing written on it. If you are missing that, I do have extras. Yes. Alright, taking us about 12, so we're gonna do that in our calculator following these steps. So we're gonna put these into L1 and L2 by going into stat, edit. If you have stuff in there, clear it out. Go to the top, hit clear, go down. Or you can reset your calculator, either or. Start putting in all of your data. Some of you don't have your calculators practicing this. You definitely need to go grab it. Help each other out. Once you have that in, I'm gonna move on to the next step. So step 2 says go into stat. Scroll to the right to calculate. Go down to number 4, hit enter, or just hit 4. Scroll down to store regression equation. Hit alpha trace. And then enter into your string pages. So look at your page of instructions, step 2. Yes, Kristen. Yes. Use that front page, yes.
No.
Even though the question does not ask you to find your line of best fit, still write it down. That way I can see, did your equation come out wrong? And that's why your answer is wrong, or was your answer was wrong? Negative 12.13 plus 272.27. That's plus 2.27. So just somewhere next to the problem, write that equation. You don't have to write all the decimal places. Just round to 2 decimals. And then the question says, using the line of best fit, which is the closest to the length of time it should take Marcia's 6-year-old niece to run 1 line. So this is step 3. We're gonna put 6 in, store it for X. 6 STOX, enter. And then we're gonna go back and grab our equation from alpha trace and hit enter twice. For this, it needs to be the closest. So round up if necessary, not round down. So the closest of the answers would be 200. Would be. For number 12, make sure you change the years to 0 and then how many years has it been since? Other questions on this page?
How do you reset our calculator?
Second plus 712.
Did you say that this was, for 13 with 200?
Yes, because it was 199 and something, and we would round up, not down.
How do you, I know you do that to my place. And how does it work?
The 200,
So when you say that
because our answer was 199. So the closest would be 200, but I feel like that's not what you're asking.
But like, I'm saying like how does 30.09 X minus 1.7?
You're talking about 13.
Yeah.
I'm talking about 11. There we go. All right, other questions on this page? Remember the difference between interpolation and extrapolation for 12? If no other questions on that page, go on to the next. Notice that each of these has an equation and a solution box. That's where I want your equation that you come up with and your solution with whatever label, cost, so money, cost, number of dimes, so dimes. What questions do we have? Want to go over? Addison, I'm sorry. 14. Okay. For 14. Think about what type of problem this is, find the important information. This is at 15.75 per hour. The $25 deposit. We have to write and solve a linear equation to find the total cost from these hours. What did they give us? What information can you pick out that they gave us? Do we have any specific variables that stand out to you? Y, M, X, B? And which one?
No, I was just working right here.
So you guys have to be able to pick this stuff out. I can't just tell you that information. So of the stuff that's given, what do you think each one would represent? Chris, were you gonna say something? The 15.75 per, what would that be? There's something in there that tells you what that is. That would be your slope, that would be your M. Says the word per. What else? Because it's a one-time thing. So because they give us our M and our B, this is gonna be like that first type. Where we're given M and B, we're gonna find X or Y. So then we have total cost and number of hours, which would be X, which would be Y. Now, let's figure out how many hours would that be? 4. Okay, so now we have all of our equation pieces, we just have to put them together. We don't know what Y is, so that's gonna stay our variable. We know our M is 1575. You know our X is 4. I'm running out of space. And our B is 25, so plus 25. Figure out what that solution would be.
You know what the bottom thing I think?
Same thing as this. 1575 times 4 equals, or plus 25 equals Y. I see that backwards. Is that what we all got? 88?
Yeah.
Yes. I'll ask if I didn't know. So then our total cost would be $88. Other questions on this page? Taylor?
16.
So here, you're given 800 square foot office for $975, 1100 square foot office, $1125. You write and solve a linear equation to find the monthly rent for 1500. What did they give us? Say that again. A list of numbers or a list of 2 sets of ordered pairs. They didn't give us our M because you don't see anything that says per. They didn't give us our B because there's not like a one-time fee. So this would be your X1, your Y1, X2, Y2. And then at that point, you have a choice. Either do this algebraically, find the slope, find the y-intercept, and then answer the question. Or use your line of best fit stuff and do it that way. Which would we rather? The algebraic way. So then our Y2 would be 1125. Our Y1 is 975. X2 is 1100. X1 is 800. Figure out what that would be.
Top one would be 150. Bottom of the big 300.
Divide that.
1/2.
So that would be our slope, or 0.5 would represent the square footage per sorry, the cost per square footage. Then we have to find our B, pick whichever point you want. I'm gonna use x1 and y1, so y minus 975 equals 1/2 times x times 800. And then we're going to distribute and solve for y. And then get y by itself by adding 975 on both sides. So our equation is gonna be y equals 1/2 x plus 575. You can double check that math, if I didn't do that right. And then we have to use that equation to find our final answer. So we're looking for the rent of something that's 1,500. So the rent is going to be our y, we don't know what that is. The square footage is 1,500. And we would put that in and solve to get our answer.
1,325.
So we all got? That would be the answer. Other questions on this page? Okay, and this one, this is similar to one we did the other day. So she has nickels and dimes. We know the total value, 780. She has 66 nickels. We have to find the number of dimes. So because it's comparing two different things, this is one you have to set up using your standard form, ax plus by equals c. Start with your total, your c. What is that? Your A and your B are going to be what the nickel and dime are worth, which is what? 5 cents and 10 cents. It's very nice. Somewhere on there, you need to tell me what A and B represent, the dime and nickels worth. So then 66 nickels, would that be X or would that be Y? If it has to be AX plus BY. Look at A. That should help you. We know the number of nickels and we see something else with nickels, those have to go together. So
66x plus 85.
66 is going to be X. Which means the number of dimes is going to be Y. So we have 0.5, we have X, we have 0.10, and sorry, our X is 66. So now I'll use these numbers and variables to come up with our equation.
0.5 times 8 plus 0.5.
Yes. So then after you have your equation, that's going to be the same equation you put in here. and then start solving. So then what would our y equal?
-4.4.
Shouldn't be negative, so since these are real world problems, you shouldn't get a negative answer. And it wouldn't be a decimal either, because we're looking for number of dimes. We have 4.5 divided by 0.10. It should be 45. And then be specific, 45 dimes. Other questions on this page? What number? The work is in 7 though. If you don't have any other questions, go ahead and clear off your desk except for the calculator page of instructions. Keep your calculator out, something to write with. I need everyone's cell phones put in a calculator pocket. If you have a smartwatch, either take it off or put it with your phone.